Readers, in the last scene that we read, and you were jotting notes, did you learn more about Dorothy from the scene? Thinking about how the setting was affecting her, thinking about her motivations. Here's the thing, in complicated texts, authors won't always neatly divide their books into story or information. Sometimes they'll be woven together, and as readers, you'll have to draw on both types of schema as you read. I'll read on, and this time, will you try to do this all more naturally? If you think you hear a story part, in the back of your mind, think story and use your story schema. If you think you hear an informational part, use your information schema. Try to develop some new thinking using either schema or both. Take a seat. The room for the West Area Computing Pool was set up for about 20 workers. As members of a pool, each woman had to be ready to work on any mathematical assignment that came through the door. Because the engineering problems that the Langley Laboratory worked on were so complex, the problems had to be broken down into smaller parts, with each part assigned to a different woman. Dorothy Vaughan took a seat, and the women welcomed her. Most had graduated from black colleges like Hampton Institute, the Virginia State College for Negroes, or Arkansas Agricultural, Mechanical, and Normal College. Many of the women had years of teaching experience. Others were starting their first jobs just out of college. Quite a few of the women belonged to the same civic organizations, churches, and Greek letter organizations, such as Alpha Kappa Alpha or Delta Sigma Theta. Dorothy realized that by working in Langley's West Computing section, she was in one of the world's most exclusive groups. In 1940, just 2% of all black women earned college degrees, and 60% of those women became teachers, most in public elementary or high schools. At a time when just 10% of white women and not even a third of white men had earned college degrees, the West computers had found jobs at the single best and biggest aeronautical research complex in the world. At the front of the room, like teachers in a classroom, sat two white women, the West Computing section head and her assistant. The work that came to a particular section usually flowed from the top of the pyramid down. Engineers came to the head of the entire computing operation, who handed down tasks to each section head, who then divided up the work among the women in her section. Over time, some of the engineers developed favorites and brought assignments directly to the section head or even to a particular human computer. Dorothy was a welcome addition to the computer pool. The women had too much work to do in too little time. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics planned to double the size of Langley's West area in the next 3 years. When Dorothy arrived, the agency was scrambling to keep up with the American aircraft industry, which had gone from the country's 43rd largest industry in 1938 to the world's number one by 1943. Let's try this. Take a minute to jot and think about the ideas you're forming about these characters and the information you're learning. Did you study the characters closely and think a lot about Dorothy and the other women computers? You may have noticed how they welcomed new women to the lab, that many had been a part of the same sorority or the same college. And when you think about those details and how they fit together, did you notice that the women in the West Computer Lab seem to have a tight-knit relationship, partially because of the circumstances and partially because of their shared life experiences? And were you also thinking about central ideas? You may have noticed one idea that seemed pretty straightforward, that World War II led to growth in the aircraft industry, or some other ideas that college education levels were low in the country for everyone, but especially for Black women. Another kind of notebook work you could do is to track ideas that continue to play an important role in the text. You might make a page for how World War II changed the aircraft industry and jot some bullets of details from this section to get started. Let's read on. And keep in mind that you might need to draw on both your story and information schemas to do powerful thinking. Get your notebooks ready to continue to track key stories and ideas. Trouble in the lunchroom. In the middle of the day, the women of West Computing walked as a group over to the cafeteria. Langley was so crowded that each team has a designated 30-minute window for lunch, just enough time for a quick meal and a little conversation. Most groups sat together out of habit. For Dorothy and the West computers, segregated seating was required. The women of West Computing were the only Black women professionals at the laboratory, not exactly excluded, but not quite included either. A white cardboard sign on a table in the back of the cafeteria said colored computers in crisply stenciled black letters. It was the only sign in the cafeteria. No other group needed assigned seating. This kind of racial insult was all too common. It was a kind of subtle jab that African Americans had learned to tolerate, if not accept, in order to function in their daily lives. The women probably expected it, but in the environment of the laboratory, a place that had chosen them for their intellectual talents, the sign seemed particularly offensive. At first, the women tried to ignore the sign. They pushed it aside and tried to pretend it wasn't there. In the office, the women felt equal, but in the cafeteria and the bathrooms, the colored signs were a reminder that some were more equal than others. What do you think? Use your notebook to jot. You might start a character timeline or pressure map to think about the characters. Or you might use boxes of bullets or a web to jot down some new details that connect to a central idea. Take a minute and pause the video and set something up, and then we'll reread and then read on. I'm going to reread this section so you can keep doing the deep thinking that you're doing. Trouble in the lunchroom. In the middle of the day, the women of West Computing walked as a group over to the cafeteria. Langley was so crowded that each team had a designated 30-minute window for lunch, just enough time for a quick meal and a little conversation. Most groups sat together out of habit. For Dorothy and the West computers, segregated seating was required. The women of West Computing were the only Black women professionals at the laboratory, not exactly excluded, but not quite included either. A white cardboard sign on a table in the back of the cafeteria said colored computers in crisply stenciled black letters. It was the only sign in the cafeteria. No other group needed assigned seating. This kind of racial insult was all too common. It was a kind of subtle jab that African Americans had learned to tolerate, if not accept, in order to function in their daily lives. The women probably expected it, but in the environment of the laboratory, a place that had chosen them for their intellectual talents, the sign seemed particularly offensive. At first, the women tried to ignore the sign. They pushed it aside and tried to pretend it wasn't there. In the office, the women felt equal, but in the cafeteria and the bathrooms, the colored signs were a reminder that some were more equal than others. Go back to the lesson platform and begin with Read Aloud Part 3.